You can run,
but no can hide.
When worlds collide, you'll laugh so hard, you'll swear you died. When worlds collide, hold my hand, I'll be your guide. When worlds collide.
The Man Machine sold even better than Trans-Europe Express and also got decent reviews. People had a lot of time to digest it too, as Kraftwerk wouldn't release their next album for 3 years, their longest album gap yet. During this time, other artists started trying out synthpop, causing a giant rise in the genre's popularity. So the obvious question is, what were Kraftwerk even doing during all this? Well, making the next record. The recording sessions, like all others, were secretive, but we can now tell that they were making massive changes. Like, apparently 1 entire year of its development was solely devoted to making the electronic instruments that would later be used on it. Their sound had changed with every album they've made up to this point, but this was starting to look like a total rebranding of their synthpop too. The open soundscapes of before were now made claustrophobic. The pristine synths now sounded fragile and came from more eclectic sources. The band adjusted their focus to modern computers and how they would come to affect our lives. Eventually, in 1981, Computer World was released. The album cover by Emil Schult immediately catches the eye with its saturated yellow and depicts the band members' faces on the Hazeltine 1500 computer terminal. The insides have a few pictures of the band's mannequins in different poses, and the green and black design on the vinyl looks awesome. Definitely one of their more interesting album designs. The changes in sound mentioned before are immediately apparent on the title track with its marching beat and one-note bass line, soon joined in by the song's main motif, which sounds exactly like a computer startup sound. Lyrics, some of which coming from the Speak and Spell toy, are introduced that I think comment on how intelligence and banking systems are dependent on computers for storing unimaginable amounts of data, something that has made them so large and powerful.
It is Catalogue and Deutsche Bank, FBI and Scotland Yard.
This is supported by the German lyrics, which include a line roughly translating to "They have our data there." All this makes Computer World a good track, but nothing I'd jump at the chance to listen to, as it doesn't change much over its 5 minutes. Next up is Pocket Calculator, which is notable for its use of actual calculators like the Casio FX501P programmable calculator, as well as the stylophone and the Bee Gees Rhythm Machine. A literal toy. What's even better was when they performed this track live, they did it on these tiny synths and even let the crowd play them, which is the best thing ever. The song itself is absolutely adorable. It's fun, upbeat, has a video game-like sound predating 8-bit by a few years, is very well made, and has quirky lyrics about operating a calculator. I swear to God, you could slap this on an episode of Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared.
I'm the operator with my pocket calculator.
Pocket Calculator was translated into several languages for its single, notably getting a Japanese version called Dentaku with a punchier vocal delivery and weird voice effect. There was also a Kraftwerk branded musical calculator released alongside it that came with instructions for playing their songs. Hell yeah, I want that! Next up is probably the most famous track on this album, and also my least favorite in numbers. This one pairs a wide variety of robotic voices counting in different languages with a bouncy beat and detuned bass line that sounds like it's from a late period Aphex Twin release. That beat was definitely made for the dance floor, and the idea at the center of the track is novel, but I think it could have been executed a lot better. It's not my thing, and there's nothing flashy here either. It's just counting, so I have mixed feelings. I don't think it would be so iconic if it and Trans-Europe Express weren't sampled in Planet Rock by Africa Bambaataa, a huge fan of Kraftwerk, and the Soul Sonic Force a year later. This was an incredibly influential hit in the worlds of hip-hop, techno, and electro. Going back to numbers though, it seamlessly transitions into a sequel to the title track of all things, now mixed with aspects of numbers. It's another novel idea, but doesn't sound special enough to warrant its existence outside of the ending's jumbled mess of voices. Starting the second disc is Computer Love. Oh my god, this song is amazing. It's a lovely, upbeat, and emotional jam where the minimal sound that I haven't been the biggest fan of so far comes off feeling surprisingly warm and human. And the best part about it is that it just keeps getting better the longer you listen. It's like Kraftwerk put actual love into a synthesizer. Forget I said that. Still, Computer Love is my second favorite Kraftwerk track ever. It's so good that it more than makes up for flaws like that weird vocal effect and lyrics that seem incomplete. Computer Love was yet another single, specifically a double A-side with The Model, making it one of the most stacked singles ever. It deservedly went #1 in the UK. Computer Love was also notably sampled by Coldplay with their song Talk. Coldplay went through the trouble of taking 9 hours to write a letter in German seeking permission for the song when most artists don't even bother to ask. What took them 9 hours? Jesus. Home Computer's next, which uses the startup sound of the Speak and Spell toy for its intro before the menacing duo of a catchy bassline and harpsichord-like synth join in. The lyrics point to home computers as a developing technology that will guide us to the future, and yeah, they were right.
I program my home computer, beam myself into the future.
These sections are a vibe, but they are broken up by abstract passages full of escalating melodies. I guess they're supposed to represent being beamed into the future. I really don't like these parts as they go on forever. However, they add some space to a closed-off album, and also, alongside Hall of Mirrors, influenced a similar part in Cybertron's Clear, showing a connection between Kraftwerk and the Belleville 3, as well as Detroit techno. The Belleville 3 even met up with Kraftwerk and brought them out to clubs. That's an interesting image. Going back to Home Computer though, it's overall okay. Something which I can also say for the closer, it's more fun to compute. An extension of Home Computer with a few new elements like a satisfying beat and a shrill synth that would later be used as a hook in Fergalicious. Huh.
It's never too confused.
It has merit, but doesn't deserve a 4-minute runtime. So Computer World is a fine album. It's just so decent. I dare even say it's good. Sorry to say this, but while I do like Computer World, I'm not a fan of it. Which may come as a surprise, as Computer World is widely regarded as one of the best and greatest albums in electronic music history. It's viewed as a record that changed everything and literally predicted the future, but for the longest time outside of like 2 tracks, I never understood that narrative. It wasn't until I fully submerged myself in this album that I got why it's so beloved. Firstly, it can be seen as a backlash to the synthpop sound Kraftwerk helped create. They showed that you didn't need expensive custom equipment, but could get all the instruments you needed at Toys R Us. Secondly, every track still has boundary-breaking ideas. And lastly, Kraftwerk pulled a Nostradamus on us. They found a way to make their lyrics specific enough to point in the right direction, but vague enough to let people fill in all the gaps. This has made Computer World easily Kraftwerk's most analyzed album. Like, I've even heard some people call the title track an anti-surveillance anthem, and it very well could be, but it's not specifically stated in the lyrics. So Computer World may be a serious step down from the last two albums in my eyes, but at the end of the day, it is still a deeply well thought out record. As expected by now, Computer World performed very well both critically and sales-wise. This goes for the singles as well, like that double A-side of Computer Love and The Model, which even got the Man Machine briefly back on the charts. The world tour Kraftwerk did after went well too. Any doubts that this was the band's most successful period of their career were further tampered with the release of the Tour de France single in 1983, which was once again received with praise. There were actually plans to expand the single into a similarly themed album, but they moved on to another concept. It's a shame nothing ever came of it. Still, the band were doing amazing, which means it was the perfect time for everything to go wrong. First of all, in 1983, recording was delayed when Ralph fractured his skull in a cycling accident. Wear your helmet, kids. The same year, their next album by the name of Technopop was delayed. This was done to redo the production and change its name, but the complete secrecy of the recording sessions, as well as the fact that a bunch of materials with the wrong name were accidentally made, ignited a fire of rumors about a lost, scrapped album. And then, Wolfgang Fleurer started showing up less and less to the studio until he went into furniture designing, quitting the band and leaving his role in the next album's production unclear. He didn't leave music for good though, as he's been pretty active over the past 10 years. Nonetheless, this marked the end of Kraftwerk's classic lineup, one that lasted 12 years. Kraftwerk brought in Fritz Hilpert to replace him. Things were tough, but Kraftwerk kept pushing on with the next album. They adopted a darker sound with a prominent use of drones, robotic vocals, and reverb giving everything space to breathe. The band were also experimenting, as always, with new technologies like digital instrumentation. What was now called Electric Cafe would finally come out in 1986. Yes, 5 years after Computer World. The album's design has heavy use of computer-generated imagery, something that was still novel at the time. The front and back covers depict the four band members' metallic floating heads. It's a bit creepy, but I've always liked early CGI stuff like this. Same thing goes for the insides, which have wireframe versions of the band, as well as pictures of the mannequin heads used to create the wireframes. Finally getting into Electric Cafe though, it starts with a suite of 3 tracks. It isn't as cohesive as previous suites, but there are some recurring elements. Boing Boom Chock starts it off, which is centered on voices spouting percussive phrases over a very 80s sounding beat with brief snippets of melody. It's definitely weird, but it's also damn satisfying and fun. It's just what I wanted to see in numbers. There's a sudden transition into technopop. For 7 minutes, the same melody is played on a lush string section. Pristine synths.
Sonido electrónico.
And this metallic piece of percussion that is not as clever as Kraftwerk seems to think it is. The lyrics for once are about the music itself, although in different languages. Technopop does go on like 2 minutes too long, but I still really enjoy it whenever I listen to it. Once again, those synths and strings are so lush. A demo version of the song from 1983 exists too, and wow, it's different. Closer to Franz Schubert than Technopop, really. The fun's interrupted by the foreboding drones at the beginning of Music Nonstop, the first single, finale of the suite, and centerpiece of the album. It's first and foremost a demonstration of Kraftwerk's mastery of the drums, with complex rhythms and an infectious, pulsing snare. The main melodies are provided by manipulated vocals, which may seem off-putting at first, but actually add a lot to the track. It's a jam and my 9th favorite Kraftwerk track.
Music non-stop.
Music Nonstop also has one of the first ever CGI music videos, coming a year after Money for Nothing, showing the models from the album's packaging moving about. These faces were already off-putting on the cover, but now that they're moving around, it's undeniably creepy. However, this music video still has some awesome visuals and is a technical marvel. Props go out to Rebecca Allen. Things get even better with the telephone call, the second single which surprisingly sees Karl Bartos doing the vocals.
I give you my affection and I give you my time. Try to get a connection on the telephone line.
I can't think of a single thing that isn't perfect about this pure slice of synth pop. Karl's shaky vocals are very endearing, the samples of phones and intercept messages are clever additions to the percussion, every melody is an earworm, those strings add a lot of emotion, the lengthy outro is interesting, and it's a love song, believe it or not. Of course, it's filtered through Kraftwerk's usual brand of depersonalized simplicity, but it's interesting seeing how the band took on a human emotion by seeing it through the lens of a telephone.
You're so close, but far away.
This track also hits a very personal note for me, making it my 3rd most favorite Kraftwerk song. I do have to admit the music video kinda sucks though. It has this dramatic noir type deal going on, which is cool for like a minute before you realize nothing is happening. If you want to see Kraftwerk directly discuss deeply personal emotions, then here comes Sex Object. This track is all around angry, from the melodramatic strings to the confrontational vocals about being taken advantage of sexually. We're not talking about machines anymore, to say the least. Unless that machine is the penis.
I've had enough, and that's a fact.
This would be their darkest track, but the passages of multiple robo vocals saying yes and no alongside a slap bass solo make it more of an oddity than anything.
Object.
No. Si quieres.
It's still a good track though, especially with the cathartic ending. Then there is the finale and title track. This one is another angsty song with a hazy lead that really gets to shine at the track's end, amazing but underutilized bass, and deep grumbles that give off Legend of Zelda vibes. It's a really unique soundscape for Kraftwerk. The lyrics in different languages are vague, but seems to be describing music and art in the modern age, with cutesy robotic title drops in between.
Musik, Rhythmik.
It's an interesting way to end the album, and once again, a track I always have fun with. But that was Electric Cafe, both the song and the album. Wasn't it great? Well, that's a tough question. Electric Cafe is Kraftwerk's most contentious album. Reviews have especially been mixed, prominently citing a lack of a consistent theme and Kraftwerk's signature boundary breaking, both of which are valid observations. Like, take a step back and consider that Sex Object comes right after the telephone call. And remember that this album came out in 1986. By then, the 80s explosion of synthpop had already peaked, and other bands and artists had perfected their own takes on the genre. Frankly, this album made Kraftwerk look really behind the times. But were they though? Every time I listen to this album, I can't help but hear the groundwork being laid for another genre that would emerge a few years later called braindance, better known as IDM. Electric Cafe's dark atmospheres, liberal use of reverb, clean synth work, quirky experimental beats, and creative sample choices can be found in a lot of braindance. It's not an exact match, but am I the only person who sees it? And even if we ignore that, critics of this album seem to be way too hung up on this album's perceived lack of revolutionary ideas to see that it's still a great album with great songs. Yes, it's thematically inconsistent and takes several listens to get into, but it also reaches the same heights as Kraftwerk's previous records with a sound that's surprisingly personal and unique in an already one-of-a-kind discography. It deserves more praise. As explicitly stated before, the reception to Electric Cafe was mixed, but hey, at least it sold well. If you expected the process for making the next album to be any easier though, then you would be sorely mistaken. While no skulls were fractured, Ralph and Florian started investing their time into lengthy projects, like completely rebuilding Clang Clang Studios and buying a synclavier, a complex synth that takes years to learn. There was also an explosion of advancements in music technology during this period, all of which Kraftwerk tried to keep up with. This meant that while there was a lot of work happening, there was no new music actually being made. Then, what started as the idea for a best of compilation turned into a complete remix album of classic Kraftwerk tracks, remixed by the band themselves. This proved too much for Karl Bartos, who wanted to make original music. This sadly caused him to leave the band. He would go on to start a collaborative project called Electric Music before going solo. Funnily enough, he wouldn't be releasing music much more frequently than Kraftwerk, going 10 years between records at points. For now, Kraftwerk replaced him with Fernando Abrantes. If this wasn't sad enough, Conrad Plank, the man who made Kraftwerk's first few albums possible and did so much for the emergence of krautrock and synthpop, died in 1987. This probably didn't delay the album at all, but it still must have been tough. The mix would finally come out in 1991 though, another 5 years after their previous record. As mentioned before, this is a remix album of Kraftwerk by Kraftwerk. These aren't straight remixes either, but they all are dance remixes, with hard beats and a modernized sound. The album's design reflects this, prominently displaying the new robot versions of each band member. While they might have looked slick at the time, they, as well as this album's design, look very ugly in the age of Boston Dynamics. Speaking of robots though, this album's version of the robots got a high-profile re-release this time, as it got a huge glow-up with a lot of impressive new additions, including a faster danceable groove, as well as a 9-minute runtime. There's also this music video which shows the robots in all their nightmarish glory. For a time, as previously mentioned, they'd even take these robots out to live performances and just have them dance when this track came on. Jesus. Another track that got a re-release was Radioactivity. If the original was a small indie film, then this version would be a ridiculously over-budget Hollywood blockbuster. Its sound is epic and in-your-face with a punchier kick and overwhelming walls of sound. Its most interesting difference has nothing to do with the music though, but rather its new message. It's now an anti-nuclear power anthem. That's right, Kraftwerk just got political. They're not subtle about it too, citing Chernobyl, Hiroshima, and contaminated populations in the lyrics with Morse code SOS signs. Like they literally say, stop radioactivity. While the original song definitely has its simpler appeal, this version goes way too hard to ignore. Going deeper into the compilation, other remixes like that of Computer Love, Music Nonstop, and Home Computer do a similar thing, being far more poppier, flashier, and better versions than the originals, even if the latter is way too long. These ones don't do anything too crazy though, unlike other tracks like the Trans-Europe Express suite. Trans-Europe Express only gets a slightly more modernized remix, but things get weird when we skip to Abzug. That is actually just a version of Metal on Metal with glitchier percussion and lengthier experiments with the Doppler effect. The suite ends on Metal, which is just Metal on Metal and Abzug combined together, but now with some awesome new strings near the end. It's weird, but I think it's referencing the fact that many original pressings of TEE combine Metal on Metal and Abzug. Still, this unique remix sounds amazing. Two not-so-good examples of this are Pocket Calculator and Autobahn. Pocket Calculator and its previously mentioned Japanese version, Dentaku, just sounds so unnatural with a hard dance beat on them. Like a dance beat fits on Clang Clang more than Pocket Calculator.
I'm the operator with my pocket calculator.
And as for Autobahn, it's one of the worst sounding remixes here, especially with that annoying solo after the midpoint. And while the original Autobahn was a bit too long for me, this 9-minute version feels way too short and underwhelming. So yeah, the mix is odd, but don't let my criticisms distract you from the fact that this is a good album though. All these remixes are based on great source material, and I think the majority of changes are improvements. They more often than not liven up formerly stiff mixes, which I love to see. Also, the fact that Kraftwerk put so much effort into completely remaking all these old tracks during this tumultuous era of their career, when many other artists would just settle for a best of compilation, is admirable and just goes to show why they are so different. But the faults are hard to ignore. This album's emphasis on danceable reworkings definitely fits Kraftwerk's massive influence in the world of dance music, but doesn't fit some of these song choices, and other remixes sound half-assed, which makes it hard for me to wholeheartedly recommend this project. The mix's influence in Kraftwerk's later work needs to be mentioned though. Many of the songs they play live today sound closer to these versions than the originals, and Kraftwerk themselves considers the mix a part of the Big 8. This album also set the course for Kraftwerk's future, showing that messing around with their old music to various extents is an option when original music isn't. However, we are going to have to go through a lot of nothing before we get there.
Wants to be dominated, will dominate you, will ask you to be gentle.
The mix sold very well and even seemed to have more favorable reviews than Electric Cafe. But besides changing out Fernando Abrantes for Henning Schmitz, someone who had been with Kraftwerk since at least Electric Cafe, and doing some touring, Kraftwerk went almost completely dark after it came out. It wasn't until 1997 and 98 when Kraftwerk did their first large tour in years, and surprisingly enough, they started dropping new material during some of these shows. All 3 of these new tracks are repetitive jams that are higher in tempo and rely on improvisation. Tango is the most well-known, still being played live today. Combined with Airwaves' intro for some reason, it has a creepy vibe. Umweltverschmutzung, aka environmental pollution, or tribal gathering, is basically a bunch of random ideas stitched together, some of which are cool, some of which aren't. These 2 tracks are decent at best, but the one that would fit best on an album is Lichthof, or Atrium, which was only ever played once. Its manipulated vocals, pleasant synths, and calming breakdown make it the most interesting listen of the 3. However, these were just simple tracks used to spice up live shows that only fans at the time knew of. The first widely publicized release from Kraftwerk would be the Expo 2000 single in late 1999. It's named after the World Expo that took place in Hanover, Germany, for which Kraftwerk were commissioned to make a jingle.
Expo 2000.
Expo 2000 is also Kraftwerk's first proper shot at chill out. They've made ambient songs and calming ballads before, but Expo's lush atmosphere and tight beat are indisputably chill out. It's a very pleasant listen with vocals in various languages naming the Expo and its pavilions.
Expo 2000.
What's better is that Kraftwerk and other artists like Orbital did several remixes of Expo 2000, some of which make some exciting changes. All these new songs were very promising, as elements from them, like the faster beats, meandering compositions, and engrossing futuristic atmospheres, would make their way onto the next album. They also show that Kraftwerk were still making new music. They weren't just sitting around doing nothing, they were just really slow. And as their recent creative streak continued, they noticed that the 100th anniversary of the Tour de France was coming up. So they decided to revive the old Tour de France album concept they had from 1983. Those out of the loop may wonder why Kraftwerk cares so much about this one race, but actually its members have been obsessed with cycling ever since the Man Machine. So Ralph and Florian dug up the old Tour de France album concept and French lyrics, and several days after the 2003 Tour de France, and 17 years after their last album of original music, the Tour de France soundtracks, or just Tour de France, was released. The album's cover recycles the 1983 singles art, which is understandable. However, the insides have some cool designs like this depiction of the Eiffel Tower. Also, the 4 cyclists in a row motif will never not look awesome. This album begins with Prologue, a beautiful 30-second intro that drops you into a muffled, lush soundscape, making an immediate impression. I never realized until doing research for this video that Prologue got its name from an actual stage in the race, which is a nice touch. The same thing goes for Tour de France A Top 1 through 3, a suite of tracks that gave me the impression that there are only 3 stages to the Tour de France, but no, there's actually a lot. I am learning so much! A Top 1 and 3, while separate, are almost identical with speedy bicycle percussion, monotone vocals poetically describing the race in French, and delayed bass lines that sometimes go off into home computer-esque diatribes, occasionally joined by beautiful strings. This is all good in a top 1, but by the time a top 3 comes along, I'm bored by how little variation there is. It's confusing honestly, and changes to the formula are only made with the next track, Chrono. It briefly strips away everything except the percussion and the bass, which several effects are slapped onto. It's not terrible, but it's one of my least favorite Kraftwerk songs because this is the 3rd track in a row doing almost the exact same thing. Tour de France A Top 1 was all I needed. 2 sequels weren't necessary. Thankfully, Tour de France A Top 2 breaks up the monotony. I'll just say it, this is my most favorite Kraftwerk track. No debate. When the Wonky Angle introduced me to Kraftwerk with this album, this song is what instantly hooked me. It's why I first listened to this album, and later all the others too. It does have the same bicycle percussion and lyrics as the surrounding tracks, but the atmosphere is what makes it special. Everything is caked in layers of lush effects, creating what sounds like a musical rendition of Frutiger Arrow. I especially love all the subtle sounds in the background that bounce all over the place, as well as how hype the main riff is, always motivating me whenever I hear it. And if there's any Kraftwerk track that I can confidently say sounds like it's from the future, it's this one. Skipping ahead, we find Vitamin. This is a steady synth-pop track with an instrumental that sounds like a chopped-up tune from some Nintendo eShop game, with subtly vocoded vocals that literally just names different vitamins in a heavy accent. Quite a fun sing-along.
Eisen, Magnesium, Carbohydrat, Protein, A, B, C, D, Vitamin.
The 8-minute runtime is overdoing it, but I can't get angry at this track. It's adorable. Aerodynamic, or aerodynamique, and its extension that didn't need to be separate in titanium pick up the tempo. The frantic undulating bass line as well as the quirky percussion are its main focal points, with frequent lush keyboard swells accompanying them. My favorite part though is the completely unintelligible vocals. The The lyrics can't actually be deciphered, revealing that they're just lists of things important for maintaining the aerodynamics of a bike, as well as the things bikes are made from. You can't say this album isn't devoted to its theme. These two tracks are pretty good and have many nice touches, but they once again go on a little long. That's something I can't say for Electrocardiogram, one of the simplest songs here. The meaning of this one is self-explanatory, being about heartbeat measurements. Of course, this means that the beat of the song is made from a heartbeat and breathing noises. The accompaniment is neat, creating a simple groove with robot vocals saying random phrases so catchy that they instantly get permanently lodged in your head. It's another decent track, but not all that special. The next song, In La Forme, starts out sounding like some futuristic racing game that's gonna amp you up, but quickly turns into a lengthy chill-out track. The unintelligible vocals are yet another list, this time of things cyclists need to remember to achieve the proper form. La Forme is slow and reflective, with a lush, effect-heavy atmosphere like Tour de France atop 2, but with a buzzing bass and some lovely melodies. It, as well as the questionably separated ambient minute-long outro and regeneration, sets the listener in a very relaxed place. Isn't that such a nice way to end the album? Oh! Okay, so that single from 1983 is here too. It's easy to forget as the previous tracks really bring your guard down, but this reworking of Tour de France picks things back up, starting with the collage of rhythmic breathing that I always feel the need to warn people about because of how suspicious it sounds. Okay guys, before this next song starts, you gotta remember that they're biking. They're not doing anything else, so don't even think that they're doing anything else, alright? Okay, got it. Anyways, despite the re-recording, you can tell this track is from the 80s, especially due to its lead and prominent slap bass. That doesn't stop this from being a phenomenal piece of synth pop filled with that Kraftwerk magic though. You can see everything they've mastered about their sound in it, from the strong theming, to the creative percussion, to the beautifully scenic synths. And the lyrics are wonderful, even if I don't know French, citing important places and moments in the Tour de France, as well as telling the story of someone repairing their bike and rejoining the race. Even with all the praise though, its awkward placing in the album is unignorable. Regeneration is such a nice closer, and I feel like this would have been better as the second track rather than the last one. Either way, this doesn't stop the Tour de France soundtracks from being a surprising album. I mean, the fact that we got an original Kraftwerk album after everything that's happened is a miracle. And oh boy were they generous, giving us 55 minutes of new music. But did they actually? Look at this album closely and you can easily spot parts where ideas were greatly stretched out. Like, did Vitamin need to be 8 minutes? Did Tour de France atop 3, Chrono and Titanium need to exist? Now, I'm not saying I want less Kraftwerk, I'm just confused as to how the band couldn't come up with 55 minutes of new music after 17 years. This sounds like a damning indictment, but I can also sing a lot of praises for the Tour de France soundtracks too. This is a special album that ingeniously combined both new and old aspects of Kraftwerk's sound. It's like they took Autobahn and recreated it with modern chill-out as their guide. I love the theming of this record too, as well as how amazing it sounds by modern standards, making for a unique listening experience. I also can't ignore the special place it has in my heart, especially for Tour de France Top 2, a song that introduced me to this amazing band. So yeah, the Tour de France Soundtracks is a great album. Or at least that's what I would say if I was stupid and an idiot. Now if the Tour de France means anything, it's biking. And well, I can't really claim to have a valid opinion on this album if I don't listen to it in its natural habitat. So, I'm gonna give it a try. Who knows, I might have like some big revelation about the album or something. So, let's go. Yeah, that was pretty good. It's safe to say the response to the Tour de France soundtracks was positive. Reviews were solid, it charted in 14 countries, and the singles sold well too. Kraftwerk were even invited out to the Tour de France to spectate in person, which was a great experience for them. Kraftwerk seemed to be back on top of the world, which means it was the perfect time for a world tour in 2004. The next year, recordings from these live gigs would be released in Kraftwerk's first ever official live album, In Minimum Maximum. Now, some of you may be wondering why it's taken so long for Kraftwerk to make a live album. I mean, they've been touring ever since 1970. Well, the answer is technology. Kraftwerk has always been innovating in the studio. However, bringing those innovations out on tour has historically been difficult. Back in the day, they had to use pre-recorded tapes or session musicians for live gigs while hauling all their equipment everywhere. This problem was so serious that for the 1981 World Tour, they completely rebuilt Clang Clang Studios to make their equipment more transportable, a process that took forever and was expensive as hell. Their prayers for easily transportable technology would not be answered until the early 2000s. Now the big, bulky machinery that was used for the music and visuals could all be compacted down to a series of laptops. This allowed them to fully realize their live shows without compromise, turning them into a mix between a concert, a rave, and an art installation. So really, this was the first time they could release a live album they would actually be happy with. And damn, they delivered, with 2 CDs worth of material from their Big 8 albums, as well as a live DVD that came out not long afterwards. The original album's design is very minimal, prominently showing the band in these admittedly goofy looking outfits. The suits and ties with little lights on them look a lot better. Going into the music itself, a lot of these songs sound pretty much as you'd expect, especially the 7 cuts from Tour de France. That album came out just the previous year, so the only changes are the usual embellishments you'd expect. The Tour de France top tracks are reordered for the better, and Vitamin is now a banger though. The same thing goes for most tracks from the mix. Despite the mix's age, stuff like Autobahn, Home Computer, Pocket Calculator, The Robots, and Trans-Europe Express sound pretty much the same except for some minor improvements, mid-song language changes, and shorter runtimes. I do have to highlight Trans-Europe Express for having some of the DVD's best visuals though, right behind Tour de France a top 2. Even other tracks like Neon Lights and The Model are the same as the originals, although it's better that they remain untouched. The Model does freshen things up with different synths though. This isn't to say there aren't any songs with significant changes. For example, the opener in The Man Machine has been extended out to 8 minutes, screws around a lot with reverb, and features an epic outro with a robot choir. My only issue with this version is the grumbly vocal effect they use. It's not nearly as smooth as the one in the original. Right after this is Planet of Visions, which is a combination of a few versions of Expo 2000, now with all references to the Expo removed. This does result in a mess of dubiously connected ideas, however you can't say the combination of chill out and dance here isn't fun. Radioactivity, meanwhile, makes the mix's already on-the-nose political messaging even more obvious, with an unnerving spoken-word intro specifically calling out the Sellafield nuclear site in England, one with a long history of incidents and leaks. Also, the audience clapping at the end of the intro is poorly or perfectly timed. Numbers has some of my least favorite variations on this album. Everything's overshadowed by the annoyingly loud clicking sounds in the beat and the baffling pitch fluctuations on the vocals. Yeah, not feeling that one. Thankfully, the new version of Computer World that comes after is appreciated despite having the same beat as Numbers. Kraftwerk did a good job turning the minimal sound of the original into something fit for a live show, and finally translated those German lyrics left off 1981's English version.
CIA and KGB control the data memory.
On the subject of Computer World, Dentaku is here, and this is where I start to like it more than Pocket Calculator. Not only is that weird vocoder gone, but the way the audience excitedly sings along is adorable. The final notable one is the closer in Music Non-Stop. It's the only representation Electric Cafe gets on this album, which is odd. Maybe Kraftwerk still had a weird relationship with it. But it was an obvious pick for the last track, as by the time of this world tour, Music Non-Stop had evolved into an absolute barn burner used to close out live shows. At almost 10 minutes, this version goes hard from the very start. What makes it so special, and the reason why I heavily recommend you watch the DVD version of this too, is how after 3 minutes, each band member takes a turn performing solos before walking off stage. It's so cool to see, and it's what makes this my favorite version of Music Non-Stop. So even with all the tracks that stick close to previously released versions, there is still a lot to enjoy in Minimum Maximum. I can understand why there may be some criticism over the songs that don't do much differently, especially when considering how many changes the mix made. Personally, I don't mind it, although I do agree that this definitely isn't a part of the Big 8. I'm just happy to see Kraftwerk release such a high effort and well-made live album and DVD. Some of the more divergent mixes have also become my favorite versions of these classic Kraftwerk tracks, changing the way I view them both figuratively and quite literally because they didn't slack off with these visuals. So Minimum Maximum at best changes everything you thought you knew about these songs, and at worst still gives you a decent rendition of an electronic music classic with maybe a few disagreeable changes here and there. For a live album, I'd say that's pretty damn good.
For a limited time, Mr. Small's self-funded masterpiece, The Small Hours, featuring the hit single, Hit Single.
Hit single. Hit single.
Also featuring the haunting ballad, This Boy's Not My Son.
Can't you see it's clear to me, this boy is not my son.
Minimum Maximum got the commercial and critical success you'd expect by now. Kraftwerk seemed to be at the top of their game. However, this perception would soon start to crumble. A 2008 tour would not only see Fritz Hilbert have a heart attack mid-tour, he turned out to be okay, but would also lack the presence of Florian. A year later, it was announced that he had left Kraftwerk after years of having little involvement with the band. Some sources say this was to work on other projects, but the only significant thing he's done ever since was perform a song protesting pollution in 2015.
Stop blasting pollution in the ocean. Save the fish.
It seems like after almost 40 years, he was just done with the band. Nonetheless, this meant that Ralph was the only original member left, and that a lineup that lasted 17 years was disrupted. Oh god, this lineup lasted longer than the classic lineup. Oh, what the fuck. Kraftwerk replaced Florian with Stefan Pfaff for a few years before Falk Griefenhagen stepped in permanently. Despite all this, Kraftwerk would actually have a very active year in 2009. First, they moved out from Kling Klang Studios to an unknown location outside of Dusseldorf. Now, the place where Kraftwerk made their greatest works of art is a rentable studio. Kraftwerk also released digitally remastered versions of all their Big 8 albums, as well as a box set of them called the Catalogue, something that was originally planned for 2004 but was delayed. The box set dons pixelated versions of the four members in their live setup, which is a neat design. The individual albums all have revitalized artwork that ranges from, oh, yeah, to, huh, okay, to... Besides the covers, these albums are almost completely untouched, although Electric Cafe was changed back to technopop. I understand why, but I always thought Electric Cafe sounded more interesting. The telephone call was also shortened, with House Phone, a percussion-focused extension from the telephone call single, being added. I like it. I've actually seen some complaints about the sound quality of these remasters. I think they sound great, but no one should ever take my opinion on sound quality seriously. These remasters are the easiest to access Kraftwerk albums though, which is why I've been using them throughout this entire video. Kraftwerk topped off 2009 by sending one of their robots to do an interview for the BBC. What cheeky little fellows.
Shake hands. It's a bit scary.
After that though, Kraftwerk went into another dark period, resigning themselves to frequent touring. They tried to fight it for so long, but their reputation as a legacy act was finally cemented. However, other legacy acts don't usually play their live shows in art museums with 3D visuals, so Kraftwerk were still differentiating themselves. And then in 2017, Kraftwerk released 3D The Catalogue, a new box set compiling remixes of every track from the Big 8 albums recorded over the course of 4 years into one package. Holy shit! When it dropped, it was revealed to have Kraftwerk's most simplistic album design yet, copy and pasting the catalog's cover but in color palettes that represent each album. 3D The Catalogue was also revealed to be kinda sorta a live album. I say this because while they do list all the live dates recorded, each album is shortened to fit the concert format, and the vocals are live, there is no audio from the audience, and everything else can be easily confused for a studio recording. The shortened album runtime as mentioned earlier can be seen in 3D The Catalogue's version of Autobahn. 15 minutes were taken away mostly from Autobahn, Mitternacht, and Morgen Spaziergang. In this case though, I don't mind it one bit. I never cared much for the latter two, and Autobahn is now a perfectly paced 14 minutes. It also sounds better than ever, making it my preferred version of the track. Radioactivity is more of a mixed bag. The title track takes after the Mixes version a lot, and Airwaves gets an incredible reimagining here. Om Sweet Om is very disappointing though. It's still beautiful and mellow, but it never speeds up, something that gave the original a triumphant ending. Radioactivity for the most part though doesn't have many major adjustments, unlike Trans-Europe Express. They basically turned the track list inside out, which is weird, but the new mixes are so solid that it's not an issue. The Hall of Mirrors and Showroom Dummies especially get amazingly cinematic reimaginings. But not only is the whole album too short, they also completely ruined Europe Endless, fucking up its beautiful scenery and bouncy beat. The original was perfect the way it was, so I have no idea why they made so many changes. Thankfully, there's the Man Machine. The track list is shuffled, but all these great renditions are straightforward. The one exception is the Robots. Heavily based on the Mixes remix, this is legitimately my favorite version of the track. Computer World is mostly made of mixes similar to Minimum Maximum that I think are meh. However, my favorite version of Computer Love is here, and I love how Pocket Calculator is a refined version of the original while Dentaku gets all the dance elements from the mix. It's a great dynamic.
I'm the operator with my pocket calculator.
Next up is Technopop, and they fucked the telephone call! Okay, calming down. This version of the telephone call is notable for not having any vocals. Now, I understand that Carl's gone, and that it's probably out of Ralph's vocal range, but it's not the same song anymore, and something about that just really angers me. Like, this was my reaction when I first heard it. Ah! Fuck you, fuck you, fuck! The music non-stop suite that ends the album is very good at least. The mix is handled differently than the others, simply reusing the box set's versions of its tracks, but now in surround sound. Ooh! I've heard some complaints about this, but like, what else were they supposed to do? It does remind me that the mix is a badass best of album. It also reminds me that I don't have a surround sound system and now I'm sad. Planet of Visions is here though, and it's my favorite rendition of this track.
Detroit. We're so electric. Germany. They're so electric.
Finally, there's Tour de France. On the surface, you might assume I'd think it's a great improvement as Tour de France, a top 3, and Titanium are gone, while the title track is now the opener, which is close enough. But that and some solid mixes don't immediately make it perfect. After all, I still dislike Chrono, and Tour de France, a top 2 doesn't hit nearly as hard as the original.
Tour de France.
Radio Tour Information.
I would say that was it for 3D the Catalog, but there was also a sampler of this box set that put each title track and their accompanying suites onto one disc. It's great, even if Tour de France is an awkward amalgamation of 5 songs. There's also the Blu-ray full of new and improved visuals pulled straight from their live shows, which I love. Yeah, Minimum Maximum tops some of these, but there are unique HD visuals for every song. And they are all great accompaniments, which is why I've been using them throughout this entire video. So, for a box set of stuff we've already heard before, there was actually a lot to discuss with 3D the Catalog. But is it a good release? Well, it kinda depends on what it's trying to be. If it's a live album, then it's missing several things that make live albums special, like the sounds of a hyped crowd, or more open and improvisational compositions. If it's a comprehensive discography box set, then why is every song filed down as much as possible to fit into a set list? In the end, 3D the Catalog is both of them, and yet neither, which is why I have always been conflicted about it. It has many of my favorite versions of these Kraftwerk tracks alongside amazing visuals, but it's heavily bogged down by weird decisions and a lack of a cohesive identity. This is made more awkward by the fact that this will probably be Kraftwerk's last ever significant release, despite what Ralph says. Whatever it is, and whatever legacy 3D the Catalog ends up having, I'd still say it's worth a listen because of its hits, but I'd also say it's inessential because of its misses. While I had mixed thoughts on 3D the Catalog, it got the same amount of praise as almost everything Kraftwerk's ever done, which is a lot. The Grammys thought it was so good, in fact, they named it 2017's Best Electronic Album, the only Grammy Kraftwerk have ever won if you don't count their Lifetime Achievement Award from 2014. Better late than never, I guess? After such a big release, Kraftwerk kept trucking on with their almost non-stop touring. In 2018, they had a particularly special concert in Stuttgart, Germany. For Space Lab, they set up a live video feed to the International Space Station where German astronaut Alexander Gerst spoke to the crowd and played along with the band. How am I only now finding out about this? This is awesome! Then in 2020, when COVID hit, Kraftwerk suddenly found themselves unable to tour, so they put out remixes. A double album compilation of, something. If an archive of old Kraftwerk remixes isn't your thing, then at least check out Nonstop, a new 8-minute rendition of several jingles Kraftwerk made for MTV Europe in the 90s.
Music, non-stop, 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 non-stop. Music, non-stop.
This reimagining of Music Nonstop may be a little long and sound like a vocoder demo in parts, but it's actually quite lovely.
Music, non-stop, non-stop. Music, non-stop, non-stop.
This was all well and fine, but it was greatly overshadowed by the passing of Florian Schneider early in 2020. He died at 73. The amount of artists who came out to express their grief over his death, though, showed how widespread his influence was. Everyone just has so much genuine respect for him. Wolfgang especially had these compelling words for him, even years after both had left the band.
With my mouth very near to his ear and said, Florian, thank you for all these wonderful 15 years we had together. And he said, correct, Wolfgang, these were the best years.
Yeah, it's sad, but as for some good news, in 2021, Kraftwerk were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Welcome Kraftwerk to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Music, non-stop.
And as of 2022, the band has started touring again, now with Jörg Bongartz taking over for Fritz Hilpert, which takes us to the end of our tour. Now that we're done covering everything, let's recap my rankings. They were actually really hard to make, as Kraftwerk's discography is just so solid. But in the end, I think The Man Machine is where Kraftwerk peaked, with Trans Europe Express coming close behind. I know I'm gonna get shit for putting Computer World and Radioactivity so low, but remember that I still like them. The only album I outright dislike is their debut. As for the albums of non-original music, I think Minimum Maximum has the most solid lineup of reimaginings and rarely ever ruins a song. And as for my favorite songs, I did list 10, but my top 3 of Tour de France, a top 2, Computer Love, and The Telephone Call stand far above all the others. Their songs all always hold close, no matter what. But Kraftwerk isn't so special just because of their songs and albums. These records also did something completely original. They are indisputably where synthpop began and had a massive influence on the entirety of electronic music. Kraftwerk's insane amount of influence can even be mapped out through all the places they've been sampled over the years, from Afrika Bambaataa to Coldplay to, and I still can't get over this, that one part in Fergalicious. No wonder people compare them to the Beatles. It must also be noted that Kraftwerk brought electronic music into the mainstream without ever watering it down. Instead, they remained creative and different throughout their entire career. So how did this music appeal to so many people who had never heard it before? Well, electronic music as a genre had no cultural background or socio-political context at the time, which meant that it appealed to everyone, and artists like Kraftwerk could take it and add their own histories and identities to it. And after all, no matter who or where you are, everyone can get down to a stiff but funky rhythm or be moved by emotional music, even if it's coming from an instrument previously seen as cold and impersonal. Kraftwerk even played into its international appeal by recording in multiple languages, but they still stayed true to their German identity through their song titles, lyrics, and compositions. I think Kraftwerk's art and commentary are also important to their success. They not only cultivated a strong musical identity, but a visual one as well, putting a massive amount of thought into stuff like their album covers, live visuals, appearances, and behavior. Contrary to the typical image of a famous rock star, Kraftwerk dressed sharp and stood almost completely still on stage. This was all a part of their belief that the music should come first, and that they were not stars but merely workers. This resulted in them keeping their personal lives out of the public eye, like, reasonable people, and famously turning down a collaboration with Michael Jackson. That's probably why most people don't know much about Kraftwerk, but Kraftwerk never cared much about the fame. And while their music was almost always rooted in European tradition, they took countless shots at predicting and creating the future. And more often than not, they created music far ahead of its time. That's not to say all their music is timeless though. I've always been against applying phrases like still sounds futuristic or could be released today to Kraftwerk, because while they made music far ahead of their time, most of it is not ahead of our time. While boundary breaking in its day, their visions of the future come from a very 70s and 80s point of view, and millions of artists have picked up where they left off and pushed even further. However, not holding up perfectly after 40, 50-ish years is not anywhere near a fierce condemnation. So if all of this still doesn't convince you as to Kraftwerk's greatness, then you must really not be in the right place. But you know what? It's fine. Thanks for watching. But I think those who don't like, or aren't interested in Kraftwerk still have to admit that while electronic music would still exist without them, its history and modern landscape would be completely unrecognizable. And so I have one last thing to say. To Ralph, Wolfgang, Karl, Fritz, Henning, Emil, Klaus Roeder, Stefan, Falk, Georg, Fernando, Klaus Dinger, Michael, Basil, Butch, Fred, Thomas, Andreas, Peter, Hausching, Eberhard, Charlie, Plato, and last but certainly not least, Florian. Thank you for all these wonderful years of music.